From the studios of KPFK Pacifica Radio in Los Angeles, this is Uprising, and I'm Sonali Kolhatkar. It's Wednesday, June 3rd, 2015. Ireland becomes the first country in the world to legalize gay marriage by public referendum. We'll turn to Michael Lee Murphy, a writer for Ricochet, about the significance of the vote and how it might be a model for democratic change. And author Sandy Tolan joins us to discuss his new book, Children of the Stone, The Power of Music in a Hard Land, where he shares the story of Palestinian musician Ramsey Abu Redwan. That's coming up after the news. Joining us now to analyze today's headlines is Courtney Morris, Assistant Professor of African American and Women's Studies at Penn State University. Hi, Courtney.
Hi, Sonali.
2 days after key provisions of the USA Patriot Act expired, the Senate passed the USA Freedom Act by a vote of 67 to 32. The House had already passed it. President Obama signed it into law immediately. The Freedom Act is being characterized as the most significant reform to surveillance laws passed since 1978. Still, activist groups working to end surveillance see the move as only a small victory, given that the Freedom Act continues mass surveillance programs that are only slightly curtailed. Under the reform law, telecommunications companies will now oversee phone records rather than the NSA. Many see the passage of the law as symbolic, a vindication not just of public outrage over revelations that intelligence agencies watch our every move, but a vindication of NSA whistleblower Edward Snowden, who revealed the extent of spying to the world and who remains a wanted man in the U.S. Courtney, how do you view the passage of this law?
Well, it seems to me that the general consensus is that this is a very positive development. I mean, the bill passed with a rare display of bipartisanship in both the House and the Senate. And I think that conservative defenders of the Patriot Act, like Mitch McConnell, really were surprised to learn how many of their own allies and constituents are really opposed to the practice of mass surveillance and sort of unregulated mass surveillance of citizens. And so in this sense, I think it is a good thing. But, really, what we have to remember here is that this isn't an eradication of mass surveillance. It's really just a reorganization of that program, and as well as the implementation of several regulations that will limit the ways that the government can access this information. But there are going to be many more battles to come in the future, particularly around access to private emails. And so this is really an important but a partial victory. And of course, the fact that Edward Snowden remains a fugitive of the law, despite the fact that now so many people seem to recognize that the program of mass surveillance was illegal and unconstitutional, is a deep irony.
And police shot and killed a Muslim man in Boston, Massachusetts yesterday. 26-year-old Usama Rahim was apparently under 24-hour FBI surveillance. He was shot by officers who say he lunged at them with a knife. Police Commissioner William Evans in a press conference said Rahim was, quote, wanted for some terrorist-related information we had received. He claimed that there was a surveillance video showing Rahim lunging at officers. The victim is the brother of a well-known Boston area imam named Ibrahim Rahim, who says his brother was shot 3 times in the back and was on the phone with their father when he was killed. His last words were, "I can't breathe." Muslim advocacy groups are demanding more information about why Usama Rahim was under investigation by the FBI's Joint Terrorism Task Force, and they're also asking for the surveillance video of the shooting to be made public. Meanwhile, a man named David Wright was just arrested in Everest, Massachusetts, when his home was raided by police, and Wright is being linked to the same investigation. Courtney, I know that many questions remain on this breaking story, but what do you make at least of how the media are already reporting it as if it was an acceptable thing for police to shoot this man instead of questioning it?
Well, I mean, at this point, we really don't have, we've not seen any of the evidence that would confirm or corroborate the Boston Police Department's account of what took place. And the media seems to be more than willing to just take their word for it without insisting that that evidence be made available. And I think really the issue here is one of determining, one, whether the shooting was justified, and two, the larger question is whether Muslims living in the Boston area are being targeted and surveilled in ways that really violate their civil liberties. And so it seems to me, I'm not a police officer, but it seems to me that if one had caught a potential terrorist, you might want to sit down and actually talk to that person and bring them into custody alive. This seems to be, at the heart of good policing. But I think more and more what we're seeing is that the police live in our communities as a kind of military occupying force rather than as a force that's meant to serve and protect. So I think that before we can draw any judgments on what's taking place here, the Boston PD is really going to need to share more information and behave in a more transparent manner.
And finally, watchdogs nationally and internationally are speaking out about financial secrecy and violations of the public trust. Senator Elizabeth Warren issued a scathing letter to Mary Jo White, who heads the Security Securities and Exchange Commission, White is supposed to be Wall Street's top regulator. But according to Warren, she has failed to hold corporations accountable on issues like publishing CEO pay and issuing waivers of SEC reviews. Warren wrote, quote, "I am disappointed you have not been the strong leader that many hoped for and that you promised to be." Meanwhile, a group of UN experts have also written an open letter warning against the secrecy, shrouding negotiations over broad treaties like the Trans-Pacific Partnership and other trade deals. The group of experts worry that these treaties are likely to impact human rights, such as the right to food and water, a clean environment, good working conditions, and more. Specifically, they demanded that, quote, "all draft treaties should be published so that parliamentarians and civil society have sufficient time to review them and to weigh the pros and cons in a democratic manner." Courtney, how important is it for civil society to see clearly what financial elites are doing?
It's crucial. I mean, we simply cannot, as a society, make decisions, informed decisions about our political leadership, about our public policy priorities, about the way that we believe that the free market should function without this kind of information. And I think if the secret mass surveillance program has taught us anything, it's that secrecy erodes public trust in the state. It also undermines the full practice of meaningful democracy. And so it is vital that the public know what's taking place and that agreements like the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which is being negotiated in secret, be made transparent and public and subject to public intervention and input. Without that, we have no protections from the free market.
Courtney, thanks as always for joining us. We'll talk to you again next week.
Bye, Sonali.
Courtney Morris is an assistant professor of African American and Women's Studies at Penn State University. This is Uprising. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Uprising. I'm Sonali Kolhatkar. In late May, Ireland became the first country in the world to legalize gay marriage by voter referendum. Through a historic campaign in the largely Catholic country, Irish voters defied a convention and pollsters to make a huge showing at the ballot box under the banner of Yes Equality. Young and old, urban and rural, Catholics and non-Catholics voted to extend the right of marriage to all. The victory was considered a landslide, with 62% voting in favour of marriage. The referendum amends Ireland's constitution to simply say that marriage is a union between two people, regardless of sex. Joining me now is Michael Lee Murphy. He's an Irish-born, New England-raised, Montreal school reporter and a contributing editor with Ricochet. Welcome to Uprising, Michael.
Thank you so much for having me.
So England, Wales, and Scotland have already legalized marriage, but by legislation. Why was Ireland the last to do it, and why did it choose a public vote rather than by legislation?
Well, I think there's a couple of different competing reasons for that. One would be, as far as the reason why Ireland would be the last to approve same-sex marriage, they had in many ways a higher hurdle to overcome, being that it was enshrined in the Constitution that same-sex marriage was banned. And that's the reason why they had to go with a popular referendum rather than legislation, because it required a change in the Constitution. So in many ways, there was a higher hurdle to overcome, but indeed they did, and they're the first country in the world to legalize same-sex marriage by popular referendum.
So then let's talk about how there is a, when this does happen, when there is a popular referendum for an issue. In this case, it was required because that was the only way to do it. But you run the risk, of course, of having a majority vote on the rights of a minority. It could have turned the other way, and I think through the hard work of a lot of organized campaigns, it turned out as a victory for human rights, but it could have turned out the other way, as we've seen in places like California, where Proposition 8 passed and a majority voted to curtail the rights of a minority, a slight majority, I should say.
Well, there's a couple of things to say about that, and one I think is that even though people seem to pay a lot of attention to Ireland, it's quite a small country. The Republic, the South, is only about 4.5 million people, so there's definitely not the kind of vast array of money, of interest groups, all weighing in on an issue like you had in California. I mean, I wouldn't presume to be an expert about California, but about Prop 8, but certainly there was much smaller amounts of people voting in Ireland, and I think it's as you said, there is a risk of putting the rights of a minority up to the vote to a popular vote. But it's a real testament to the organizing done by the Yes campaigners. And indeed, the only people really organized against the vote, for organizing for a no vote, was an outfit called the Iona Institute, which is sort of I've heard it called an AstroTurf group, which very close ties to the Catholic Church, and their organizing was just not strong. I think there was a sense that the country was changing, and the Yes campaigners really tapped into that.
And in fact, was the fact that Ireland is such a small country really an advantage to an issue like this? Because people talk to one another, people know their neighbors. There's a sense of a smaller community, a smaller group of people. I mean, the entire state of California is vastly larger than the entire country of Ireland.
Absolutely. I mean, it's been said a lot that Ireland is not really a Catholic country, but it's rather a pagan country with a thin veneer of Catholicism over the top of it. But yeah, Ireland is the village is still an extremely important aspect of Irish life and Irish society. I think sort of ironically, the Yes campaigners in Ireland, especially in the rural west of the country, took great lessons from that bit of discredited research that came out of the UC system about door-to-door campaigning and the influence. I mean, I understand that was discredited, but can
you explain that a little bit more? The door-to-door campaign?
Well, as far as I understand, there was a piece of research that came out from I think a UCLA graduate student who said that the single best way to change people's minds on specifically on the issue of same-sex marriage or equal marriage was to speak face-to-face with them. And I think it came out that this student made up some of the research, and it was discredited based on his fabricating some of it. But people in Ireland surrounding this referendum really took it to heart before it was discredited, and so they went door to door quite a bit, especially out in the West. And the thing about the West of Ireland is you really know your neighbors. It's definitely not the kind of there wouldn't be the kind of suburban divisions that there would be in this country. So I think that really had a big impact, especially in the West. As you said, it was both urban and rural populations that voted in support of the referendum, and I think the door-to-door game really helped that.
So even if you took out the urban areas, in the rural areas by themselves, there was a majority vote in favor of this referendum. So that's a lot.
In fact, out of 43 voting precincts across the country, one came out against same-sex marriage, and that was by a very slim margin, just over 1,000 votes.
Wow.
Out of some 25,000 cast, I believe. So yes, even if there was a lot of interesting talk comparing the map of this referendum to the map of the divorce referendum in 1995, which passed by a very slim margin, and that was essentially the cities Dublin, Limerick, Cork against the rural areas, which voted against legalizing divorce. But it was completely different this time around. Even the rural areas that were traditionally against, that you'd think of as being traditionally Catholic, more Catholic, came out in support of same-sex marriage.
Well, it would be interesting for a U.S. Christians/Catholics to take a lesson from Ireland that if they do support the idea of marriage, if they are against divorce, one thing to do is to support the right of anybody to marry and divorce. So, Michael, how did people organize, aside from the door-to-door campaigning? I think it's important for us to understand if Ireland struck upon a model that can be applied in other arenas. There were also, I understand, social media campaigns. There were campaigns where people literally flew back home to Ireland to vote. Families worked, to make sure that every member, every relative went out together to vote. Can you tell us a little bit about how it happened on the ground?
As I said before, it was certainly a face-to-face interaction that they based their model off of. In some ways, Ireland is unique in the sense that few countries, certainly in the English-speaking world, have had as much been defined by the hierarchy of the Catholic Church as Ireland has been over the last 2 centuries, and in many ways. This is sort of a roundabout answer, but in many ways, Irish nationalism around the time of independence became linked to Catholicism, so that the way to prove how Irish we were was to prove how Catholic we were. That mental architecture has fallen away. Another thing that's unique to Ireland, but I think has parallels in other places around the world, is Ireland recently, in 2010, received a bailout from the IMF, European Union, European Central Bank, Troika, like Greece and Spain. And so for many years, up until quite recently, national budgets had to be approved by Brussels, essentially, by the European Union. So Irish sovereignty was removed as part of this bailout program. This vote was an assertion of sovereignty, and it was an assertion of the right of Irish people to govern Irish lives. And I think there is an increasing sense across much of the world that they are losing their ability to control their own lives. And I think the Yes campaigners really tapped into that. This is our opportunity to make a very serious decision that governs our own lives. And I think if campaigners around the issue of marriage equality or around other issues, so-called social issues, can tap into that kind of idea, I think there's definitely models to be gained there.
Is there a comparison that can be made between this vote in Ireland and Scotland's independence vote, which narrowly failed?
Well, yes, I think so. And not only between Ireland and Scotland, but also between the election, with the election of Syriza in Greece, with the rise of Podemos in Spain. I think there is an increasing idea across Europe that the economic institutions and the political institutions and the institutions of power are wholly inadequate in addressing the desires and the needs of the people they govern and the people they control. I think it is certainly, there's a wave of liberatory politics, which I would class the Scottish referendum as part of. We saw it failed, but I would argue owing to a campaign of fear coming from the right in Scotland. But there's a sense across Europe that the institutions that govern people's lives have failed. writ large, and that there is an attempt to wrest back control from these institutions. And I think the Irish referendum is part of that, as well as the Scottish
I want to turn
referendum.
briefly back to the issue of the Catholic Church, and you were mentioning how the Irish are identifying less closely with the Catholic Church than they used to. The Catholic Church, the Vatican in particular, took a very hard line against this vote, despite Pope Francis's somewhat progressive approaches to other issues. The Vatican Secretary of State Cardinal Pietro Parolin said the referendum was, quote, not a defeat for Christian principles, it was a defeat for humanity. And I was just astounded by that statement. I mean, you know, the war in Syria is a defeat for humanity. The Rohingya refugee crisis is a defeat for humanity. But Irish people saying yes to gay marriage, the Vatican sees that as a defeat for humanity. How is that being seen in Ireland?
It's quite an incredible statement, isn't it? I mean, to put it quite bluntly, the Catholic Church doesn't have a leg to stand on in Ireland really anymore, for a number of reasons. In the last 15 years, say, 20 years, the extent to which the Catholic hierarchy within Ireland specifically covered up, supported sexual abuse, rampant sexual abuse, has become clear in the last 20 years or so, stretching back generations. I think the Catholic Church lost a lot of credibility when a lot of this stuff came out. The other thing about the Catholic Church, specifically in Ireland, is that the Catholic Church has been on the wrong side of a number of very important social developments in the country. The Catholic Church in Ireland famously supported and encouraged Irish people to go and fight for the fascists during the Spanish Civil War because of what they saw as concerns about the Catholic churches being burnt in Spain and so on and so forth. So they've been on the wrong side of a lot of issues throughout history. That being said, I was quite shocked by the Vatican Secretary of State with that quote, because Pope Francis has taken such a more I don't know how to phrase it, liberatory tact on a lot of issues. I forget what his exact quote was, but he said not too long ago, just in the last couple of months, you know, who am I to stand in the way of a gay person who wants to be in communion with God? And that was a fairly big moment. So I was quite shocked by the Secretary of State's comment on that. The other interesting thing about Pope Francis and why I don't rate that one retrograde quote very highly is that he has opened the door in a lot of ways to a reintroduction of liberation theology in larger Catholic teaching, which is of course a very big part of Catholicism in Latin America. So I don't know. I'm less willing to say that was a big moment for the church. I think the church is actually, you know, the church globally is moving in the right direction on these issues. Yeah. So,
Michael, I want to turn to how this vote in Ireland may or may not influence the discussion around gay marriage here in the United States. There was one Colorado Republican lawmaker named Gordon Klingenschmidt, a former Navy chaplain, who said this on his TV show about the Irish vote, quote, "There was a time when it was said that St. Patrick drove the snakes out of Ireland, and now I'm concerned that the snakes have returned to Ireland. And when I say snakes, I'm not talking about physical snakes. I'm talking about the demonic spirits inside of some of the people you see parading their sin in pride around the country, rejecting not just the Catholic Church, but rejecting Jesus Christ himself." Wow. Again, you know, wow.
Well, this is the kind of stuff you hear all the time from Republican lawmakers at the state level. But I mean, this is a man who obviously knows nothing about Ireland other than St. Patrick. So I don't know. I don't think that demonstrates. It certainly demonstrates an amount of an ideology in some quarters of America, as we've seen. But the interesting thing about Ireland and its relation to the U.S., it has quite an interesting relationship because of, Ireland has always been seen to have sort of a disproportionate level of influence on the politics of the United States. Some historians have called Ireland the 51st state. So I do think, Ireland only has 4.5 million people, but, I don't know what the number is exactly, but tens of millions of people in America would identify themselves as Irish or Irish American. So I think that there's going to be, there's a possibility for people in America who have called themselves, Irish or Irish American, who have been opposed to gay marriage, to say, well, the Irish have done it, actually. The Irish. And so I think I wouldn't. It's possible to overstate the amount of impact this could have on the United States, but I think that there's that strange ethnic connection
and
with
also,
Ireland.
of course, we don't have that option to have a federal vote on one single issue such as this in the United States. The issue of gay marriage remains right now, at least on a federal level, with the Supreme Court. Despite the fact that a majority of states have legalized gay marriage, the Supreme Court is right now considering this issue. A number of cases where it could turn, tomorrow, or I believe in this month, issue a ruling. And certainly attitudes have changed here in the United States, but given the Irish vote, attitudes internationally seem to have significantly changed as well. And I'm wondering if, going back to our question about how organizing can happen, I'm wondering what you think people can take away here in the United States, because of course we're trying to influence one group of 12 people to do the right thing rather than convince, our neighbors and friends to vote on the right thing. So
I don't pretend to understand the Supreme Court. I'm often mystified by it, but I think there is a lot to be said for the simple idea of momentum. I think things don't, liberatory movements, they don't spread geographically, they resonate, like sounds. And I think people are just tuned to the same frequency across the world now, or in many parts of the world anyway. And so I don't know, the Supreme Court often surprises people in their votes, but I do think there's a real potential for people to associate.
Michael, we've lost your audio. We're going to try to bring you right back on the line. Can you just say a few words? Okay, we're gonna call you right back. My guest, Michael Lee Murphy, is an Irish-born, New England-raised, Montreal-schooled reporter. He's also a contributing editor with Ricochet. And are you back with us, Michael?
I think so.
Yeah. Okay. Yes. Continue your sentence.
Basically, I was saying there is a real potential for people to associate the liberatory act of legalizing equal marriage with the other liberatory struggles that are going on. It's definitely something that happened in Ireland, and I think people are beginning to recognize that in the United States as well.
Interestingly, in Australia, where there's a debate around same-sex marriage, there is vitriol spewing from the Australian leadership against the Irish for the same-sex marriage. I mean, really very sad state of some of the statements. One Australian commentator slamming the Irish as a people who can't grow potatoes during a debate on same-sex marriage. So it'll be interesting to see how that influences the Australians who are tackling the same issue.
There's, I mean, that is really an unfortunate comment. There's a large class of economic migrants in Australia, and so there's, that quote from him is tinged with not only your sort of regular Irish racism against the Irish, which are characterizing them as leprechauns and so on, but there's quite a nasty economic and social racism behind that as well. I think there was a poll.
Unfortunately, Michael, we are out of time, so I'm going to have to say goodbye to you. But
it's polling very well in Australia, same-sex marriage.
So we'll certainly continue to watch that story. I want to thank you so much for joining us today.
It was my pleasure. Thanks for having me on.
My guest, Michael Lee Murphy, is a contributing editor with Ricochet, and we've been talking about the Irish vote for same-sex marriage and the model that it presents for democracy, but also the influence that it might have socially around the world. This is Uprising. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Uprising. I'm Sonali Kolhatkar. After facing mounting pressure from fans on social media, R&B star Lauryn Hill announced on May 5th that she was cancelling her upcoming concert in Israel. On her website, she stated that she wanted to be a presence supporting justice and peace, but because she was unable to organize a similar concert in the occupied Palestinian territories, she cancelled her Israeli appearance. While she didn't explicitly state support for the burgeoning boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, Hill is one of a growing number of artists respecting a cultural boycott of Israel over its treatment of Palestinians. But the increasing absence of art and music in Israel as a political act stands out in stark contrast to the blossoming of music in the occupied territories, particularly among young Palestinians. The story of how that is happening is told in a new book by Sandy Tolan, a journalist and documentary radio producer who teaches at the Annenberg School for Communication and Journalism at USC. In Children of the Stone, The Power of Music in a Hard Land, he introduces readers to Ramsey Abu Redwan, a Palestinian composer and educator whose journey took him from Palestinian refugee camps to an international education in music after he discovered the viola as a young man. Years later, he founded several music schools in the West Bank and Palestinian refugee camps. Sandy Tolan is a radio documentary producer who's created dozens of pieces for NPR and PRI. He's the co-founder of Homelands Productions, author of The Lemon Tree and Hank and Me. He's currently an associate professor at the Annenberg School for Communications and Journalism at USC, and his new book is out right now, and he now joins me in studio to talk about it. Thanks so much for joining us.
Good to be here, Sonali. Thank you.
First, let's start with Ramsey Abu Redwan. He's the guy who, as a child, was photographed throwing a stone at presumably an Israeli soldier. He was 8 years old, and in many ways, even at that young age, he became a symbol, a very different symbol to what he is today. He put down the stone eventually and picked up a viola. But tell us who he was as a child, what his background was.
Well, he grew up in Al-Amari refugee camp, which is just adjacent to Ramallah. It was founded after the Palestinian Nakba, or catastrophe, the event that historians call the First Arab-Israeli War, Israelis call the War of Independence. During that war, 750,000 Palestinians either fled or were driven out, including Ramsey's grandparents. They were from a little village called Nahni, which no longer exists, along with hundreds of other Palestinian villages that are gone now. They've been destroyed, mostly by Israel. And during that time, in 48, when his grandparents went on their journey during the Nakba, they came to Al-Amari and began living there. And Ramsey grew up with his impoverished grandparents. He helped his grandfather sweep the streets. His grandfather was a street sweeper in Ramallah, and learned all about Palestine. And when the first Intifada started in late 1987, it was the kids, the Atfal al-Hijra in Arabic, the children of the stones, who were really on the front lines. So kids like Ramsey, at age 8 years old, the photograph you mentioned, he became very famous, much like the Tiananmen Square young man in front of the tank. It was a very iconic photo of this kid who really, along with thousands of other kids, were trying to expel Israel from the military occupation, which unfortunately goes on to this day, 48 years after the Six-Day War of 67.
So just incredible to think about what this young man went through, but of course his story is quite typical, right? And the way in which you've described it, I mean, to think about what children go through, Palestinian children go through. I have to say, the descriptions in your book of being, feeling abandoned by his mother at such a young age, being ripped from his, the life that he knew, it's just heartbreaking.
Yeah, I mean, there are people all over the world who've lost a lot, but I don't recall ever meeting someone who's lost so much. Father murdered, brother murdered. He saw a 9-year-old or maybe 12-year-old girl who he kind of had a crush on in grade school, shot in the head by an Israeli soldier during the Intifada, the first Intifada. She died 6 days later. And so you'd think a kid like this, living in a refugee camp, his grandparents were poor, really raised without significant presence of either parent. For him to remake his life, he was very typical of these kids, this generation of the children of the stones, in a sense a lost generation. Israel closed schools, universities, even kindergartens during the first Intifada. Months at a time, schools were closed. So he managed to get an education, and then he had the opportunity to learn music later on.
So he essentially left his life in the Palestinian territories and for the first time stepped onto Western soil in, of all places, New Hampshire?
Yeah.
As a young man, where he was attending this music camp, and this was an incredible change and chapter in his life too, going on to where he went on to really become adept at music. And I love how you described that he was amazed that everybody at that camp read the same language, and that was the language of music.
Yeah, he actually told me that when he first went there, he had never known anything but occupation, as most of the children in the West Bank and Gaza, even though Israel isn't present in the camps themselves. I mean, it's
Not
present
today,
from the
yeah.
air. Yeah, not today, but it was at the time, and of course by air and sea, they're still, unfortunately, they're very much there now. It's an occupation by air and sea, essentially. But in any case, back then, Ramsey really didn't know anything but occupation, and he, when he got this opportunity to get a fellowship, it was during this sort of more hopeful time for many people of the Oslo era. It was before the flaws of Oslo had been as universally exposed as they are now. And many people thought this was going to lead to an independent Palestinian state. And Ramsey, in a sense, was the embodiment of many of those hopes. And so he went to New Hampshire thinking that it would be like all the other places he'd seen on television in, that America represented to him, which was there'd be skyscrapers everywhere. And he went to this rural place in this leafy chamber music camp in New Hampshire and learned Mozart. And right, when he first, in the first practice, the first rehearsal, he looked around and said, wait a minute, this guy is Chinese, and this kid's Israeli, and this one's American, and they're all looking at the same music. He thought that his music was somehow Arabic music.
Now, he went on then to found a series of schools in the Palestinian territories and also in Palestinian refugee camps. And you start out in your book saying that he had told you that this was his dream when he
Right.
was much younger. And years later, I mean, not many of us can say that we really fulfilled the dream that we explicitly set out for ourselves. How did he go about fulfilling that dream, and what has he accomplished today?
Yeah. Well, you know, one of the interesting ways to look at it, I mean, if some people, when they see, oh, it's so nice that he's put down the stone and he's picked up a viola, and he would say, I just literally changed the instruments of my resistance to the occupation. He sees music as a force of resistance, and we can talk more about
Yeah.
that. But what when I first met him, it was in '98, during this more hopeful time when people thought the two-state solution was actually going to be possible. At that time, when I did a long piece about him for NPR, and he said, you know what I want to do? I want to open up music schools for the children of Palestine. He was 18 years old, living with his impoverished grandparents in the refugee camp then. Then he got an opportunity to study in France, and he kept his focus. He always wanted to do that. Meantime, I lost touch with him for probably 10 years and ran into him quite by mistake, by chance, at an Italian restaurant in Ramallah. And I said, Ramsey, what are you doing now? He said, oh, I'm opening up music schools for the children of Palestine. He always kept his focus. And it wasn't so much that he just wanted, you know, it's not like a kumbaya moment where suddenly you have this piece of, I mean, it is a nonviolent way of dealing with the occupation, but it's for Ramsey, it's about protecting the children with music so that they can cope with the day-to-day reality of the occupation, which is, for many people in America, really off the radar screen.
Yeah, and I'm so glad you brought that up because, you know, of course, on the surface of it, for people who do know what's happening in the occupied territories, to focus on music education while Gaza gets bombed, you know, every other summer,
Yes.
it might sound like a jarring disconnect. Why is music so important within a context in which people are being killed in wars, are being occupied and repressed repressed in the West Bank,
Yes.
even inside Israel. Of course, Arab Israelis facing their own repression in the Palestinian refugee camps, horrible conditions. Why is a focus on music a constructive thing?
Yeah. Well, it's a very good question, and it's one that Ramsey has asked himself. And a lot of the people, you know, when he brought, like the Pied Piper, he is all these French musicians to begin to explore the idea of a music camp, they debated themselves this very question. There's a couple of answers to that. One is, during the Second Intifada, which was much more violent and much more loss of life, which began in late December 2000, when Ariel Sharon made this provocative visit to the Al-Aqsa Mosque compound, and where the Temple of the Mount also is. He really didn't know whether it made sense for him to continue this dream. So one time, a couple of years later, when the Second Intifada was still raging, he made a visit to a school of rehabilitation in Al-Amri refugee camp. And when he went and played the bouzuk, he also plays the Arabic bouzuk, and the kids were gathering around, and he noticed that on the walls and on the floor, the butcher paper, they were drawing pictures of tanks with orange fire exploding, mothers crying. And he thought, you know, when I'm in France, I see, you know, kids when I visit a school drawing sun and moon and stars and houses. Kids draw what they see. And he left and came back a week later, and suddenly the kids were all gathering around him, and he saw that what they were drawing was musical instruments. And that was the moment that he made a commitment. And he's told me, and anybody who'll listen, many times, I want this music to protect these children from the soldiers.
Right.
Now that sounds sort of like a soundbite in a way, but if you look at the research that's been done in war zones in South Africa under apartheid, Northern Ireland during the Troubles, Bosnia, the idea that music can actually transform the way that children see themselves and make them feel stronger and give them a different identity is really important. But there's one other thing that's important to mention. Ramsey and Al-Kamanjati, which means the violinist in Arabic,
And that's the name of his schools.
The schools that he started, they use music as a way to confront the occupation. So, I mean, one of the most amazing things I witnessed was at the checkpoint, the Kalandia checkpoint that divides Israel, divides Jerusalem from Ramallah. It's just one of the most depressing places on earth. It's huge, just fences and cattle chute guardrails and gun turrets. And these kids did what I would call, I called Operation Mozart. They did basically a peaceful guerrilla assault with music, and set up their orchestra, their music stands right in front of the soldiers at this checkpoint, and played Mozart. It was a way of basically saying, we are here, we are reclaiming this space, we belong here, and we are putting the occupation into the public light.
Now, the late and great Edward Sayid also figures into the story. And when we talk about music and art in general as a form of resistance, this was something that he also deeply espoused, and was just a great believer in the power of music. Can you tell us a little bit more about his role in this story?
Yes. Well, he, you know, as you well know, Sonali was a great champion of Palestinian rights from his post at Columbia, and also professor of comparative literature, author of Orientalism and many other well-respected books, but probably best known as a fierce defender of Palestinian rights. And he became very frustrated with Oslo. If you look at the growth of the settlements, not including the West Bank, I mean, not including East Jerusalem, the West Bank itself, outside of East Jerusalem, the population at the beginning of Oslo of Jewish settlers was 109,000. Today it's more than 350,000. This is during the so-called peace process. Edward early on saw this and became very disillusioned by it, and yet he wanted to find some sort of alternative model. By chance, he met the Israeli composer, Argentine-born classical music genius Daniel Barenboim. They struck up a very deep friendship that Barenboim himself says that they were intellectual soulmates, he told me. And They spoke every day until Edward died in 2003. And it was from this ferment of their friendship that they founded together the West Eastern Divan Orchestra. Now, the Divan doesn't enjoy the same sort of universal love that it had when Edward was alive and when they founded it, partly because the landscape of so-called dialogue under Oslo has really shifted to much more direct nonviolent confrontation represented by the BDS movement and by the Palestinians' effort at statehood. But back in this day, it was Edward's idea that we can create an alternative that can be an example. And it was this orchestra that Ramsey was invited to join and eventually did after Edward's birth, after Edward's death in 2003.
Right. So what do these music schools look like, and how have they transformed children? Because, when you think about the terrible life facing some of these children, from a Western perspective, it might be more important to give them food and water and aid, which of course they need to survive.
Mm-hmm.
But it's those other things in life that make life worth living more than just eat food and survival.
Right.
And so, of course, music and art and these sorts of things that we feel we have privilege enough to enjoy here in the Western world can make just such a huge difference. So what sort of difference has it made in the lives of young children?
Well, I'd say by and large, I mean, not to say that there's not poverty in Palestine, of course there is, but lack of food and water isn't high on the list. I mean,
and Israel actually measures very carefully the caloric intake of
Right.
Palestinians and makes sure that people have just enough to survive.
Right, especially in Gaza.
In
But,
Gaza, yeah.
I mean, I'm not talking so much about Gaza, but
Right,
the West
this is
Bank,
the West
where
Bank.
I took 6 trips for this book. But really what people need more than anything is freedom. The lack of freedom of movement in Palestine, in the West Bank, for example, I mean, there are something like 600 checkpoints, barriers, roadblocks, other physical barriers in a land that's smaller than the U.S. state of Delaware, which is the second smallest state. So what this music school does is it provides these children with a sense of freedom within the confines that they're living in, and as a way to symbolically confront the occupation. This actually changes their own view of themselves. One of the people I focused on in this book, who's the older sister of the girl on the cover, whose name is Shalalda, Rasha, her older sister, played the flute. And she told me that when she began to play, it wasn't as though the occupation disappeared, but she began to be able to contend with it and see herself in a totally different way. She said, when I play, it's like I'm alone in a forest, surrounded by a beautiful lake. I feel free. Now, of course, that doesn't suffice for actual freedom, but it gives these children a sense of dignity and pride that helps them contend with their lives in a more constructive way, and it helps them also become people who could be leaders later and in confronting the occupation itself.
What are the daily indignities that face Palestinian musicians like Ramsey Abu Redwan? In your book, you have a sort of running story that you break your chapters up with of what musicians have to do when they need to get to a concert and an Israeli soldier on a whim decides not to let them pass a checkpoint.
Yeah, you really can't understand the feeling of it until you experience it, although hopefully I'm able to do some of that in this book. But the checkpoint is the ubiquitous, unavoidable reality of Palestinians. Their lands in the West Bank have been shattered into a kind of archipelago of islands within a sea of Israeli military control. When I first started going there, you could actually drive for quite a while without seeing evidence of the occupation. Now you can't drive for 1 minute, literally. I've actually played this little game with myself when I drive around. Can you actually drive for 1 minute without seeing evidence of a soldier, a patrol, military base, settlement? You can't.
Wow.
So, and checkpoints are ubiquitous. There are these things called flying checkpoints that are set up suddenly. These kids, I mean, one of the stories I tell in the book is Allah, the young violinist at age 10 in 2008, is forced to step out of the van. They're coming back from a concert in Bethlehem, And the soldier says, "What's in that case?" And she says, "It's a violin." He said, "Do you know how to play?" She said, "Yes." He says, "Play." And her sister Rasha yells, "Don't play for him." And she ends up playing this very powerful song called El Hawadi, which means the beautiful girl in Arabic. And you know, it's something that gave her a sense of pride and dignity even under such humiliating circumstances. But those circumstances shouldn't be there to begin with. This is the daily reality. I mean, another story is Ramsey's wife, Celine, who is Lebanese by birth and grew up also in France. She was at home with her 6-month-old baby. Ramsey was off. He often goes to Europe to raise money for the school and to make a living as a musician. He was actually playing for the Queen of Holland. And Celine was home alone with their baby Hussein, and she hears somebody at the door in the middle of the night, and she goes and sees the doors getting forced open. She thinks it's a burglar, and she tells them to go away. And it turns out she looks through the little crack in the door, and there's 10 soldiers. And they said, "Step away," and they break down the door and point their guns at her. This is in a supposedly autonomous zone in Ramallah. It's autonomous except for when the Israeli military decides that it's not and notifies the Palestinian Authority, and they come in. So they burst in there, pointing their guns at her. Turns out they were looking for someone else, and they apparently broke 3 doors down that night. And when I ask people about this, the thing that's most amazing, Sonali, and you ask Allah about, you know, playing at a checkpoint or being stopped at checkpoints all the time, they just go, "Oh, it's normal."
Yeah.
I mean, these kids, that's what they know.
That's what they know. And, you know, you've made many documentaries for NPR and PRI about this conflict, and you know how biased coverage in the media can often arise from giving so-called balanced perspective on this very unbalanced fight.
Right.
Have your own thoughts on this issue evolved as you've spent more time witnessing what Palestinians face every day?
They have. They have. In fact, I mean, I think one of the things that's clear, especially with the growth of the settlements and what a lot of people call settler colonialism, I mean, it is an attempt to basically take the land. And it's been, unfortunately, largely successful, starting with Ariel Sharon, continuing with Benjamin Netanyahu, but not exclusively members of the Likud and of that sort of political bent. I mean, as I've seen what occupation does to people, to ordinary people, to children, to regular adults, how it stifles their aspirations that you and I just take for granted, the freedom that we have, just freedom of movement in this country. They have the right to freedom, and it's being suppressed. And to me, what's amazing is that you know, when you talk about press coverage, there are many fine exceptions. Look, for example, at the work of Ben Hubbard from the New York Times in Gaza last summer. It's a shining example of how great journalism still does happen in the mainstream. However, it's amazing to me how far off the map Palestinian lives are. You know, Palestinian lives matter too. And how far off the map the daily life and indignities that Palestinians have to suffer, like, unless we understand what that is, I don't see how we get to a point of arrival where you say, this is unacceptable, this can't abide, we actually have to end the occupation.
Finally, I started our conversation talking about the musical and cultural boycott of Israel as part of the BDS movement. Do you see some interesting parallels here in depriving the occupier of music and art and supplying the occupied with music and art?
Well, I hadn't actually thought about that until your question. It is interesting. I mean, the boycott movement, you know, I hesitate to compare it in volume at this point to the successful apartheid boycott movement, but there have been notable successes in terms of for example, forcing Scarlett Johansson to step down as the spokesperson for SodaStream because they build a lot of their equipment in occupied territory. Stephen Hawking's declining to go to Israel. Lauryn Hill, you mentioned earlier. And Veolia, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, the infrastructure, builder of infrastructure all over the world. There were Boston area boycotters who basically kept it from a $4 billion contract. So you're beginning to see some economic impact. Whether this, together with a cultural boycott, will end up being enough to force Israel to change its policies, to end the occupation and begin to look at what people should be looking at now, which is equal rights within what has become a single state, some with rights, some without. How long it will take before that becomes successful, it's hard to say, but it's true that there has been a lot of progress.
Sandy Tolan, best of luck to you, and thanks so much for joining us today.
Good to be here.
Sandy Tolan is a radio documentary producer who has created dozens of pieces for NPR and PRI. He's also the co-founder of Homelands Productions. He's written other books, including The Lemon Tree and Hank and Me. He's currently an associate professor at the Annenberg School for Communication and Journalism at the University of Southern California in Los Angeles. And you can find out more information about his work online at sandytolan.com. That's Sandy, Tolan.com. And by the way, for our Southern California audience, Sandy Tolan will be speaking on Friday, June 19th at 7 p.m. at an event with Truth Dig's Robert Scheer at Ted Vales, that is 20249 Inland Lane in Malibu, California. 20249 Inland Lane in Malibu, California on June 19th at 7 p.m. And that does it for our program today. This is Uprising. Anna Buss is our assistant producer. Christian Beck is our production coordinator. Dan Swerdlove is our technical director. Kiana Turner and Federico Garcia are our audio engineers. Annie Mendoza is our social media coordinator. Do subscribe to our YouTube channel at youtube.com/uprisingwithsonali. Your subscription of a very small monthly fee sustains the TV production of Uprising. We're currently at 52 subscribers. We need to get to 100. Our website is uprisingwithsonali.com. Our theme music is by Quetzal. I'm Sonali Kolhatkar, host and executive producer of Uprising. I'll see you next time.